Oh my god, I can't take my watch off. You know, you need some serious reflection when you're supposedly a highly educated, ultra successful shining star who gets outdone by a peasant. Welcome back to Why Meghan Markle Failed as a Royal, Part 2. Last week, we talked about the Americant Duchess, who tried to play the ignorant American who was always doomed to be rejected by the British royal family and failed dismally, in my opinion, at doing so. If you haven't seen the video yet, and if you enjoy history, specifically royal history, I'll put it up in the cards and in the description box if I remember. If I don't, scold me in the comment section. But I really think it would be right down your alley, as would this one. Because honestly, I mean, who are we kidding? At this point, I might as well admit that I am using Meghan Markle as a springboard to talk about what actually interests me in life. Well, one of the many things, being royal history. So right on the heels of the Ignorant American Act is the Rejected Outsider Act. Remember that parasite on a fish analogy that she used on her Netflix reality show?
What is that? What is it doing here? It doesn't look like us. It doesn't move like us. We don't like it. Get it off of us.
That's basically what she was saying. One thing I do want to make clear right from the get-go is I don't doubt that integrating into royal life can be challenging for someone who doesn't come from that sort of a background, especially when it comes to much younger brides. These days, however, royal brides are marrying well into their late 20s and early to mid 30s, making them far more experienced and more confident in their identities and comfortable in their own skin. But having said that, it would still be understandable if they initially struggled to settle into their new role. As a testament to how challenging it can be, you can even have foreign royals marrying into other royal families, and they still find it a struggle to begin with to successfully integrate, assimilate into this new life. Take Marie Antoinette, for example, who as a 14-year-old archduchess was married to 15-year-old Louis, the then Dauphin of France and the future King Louis XVI in 1770. Having been from the much more lax and relatively informal court of Austria, Versailles was a huge culture shock for the young teenager. And we know from the various letters she wrote to her mother and her ambassador at the time that she was quite homesick, and she found it very difficult to adjust to the formality and tiresome traditions of the French court. So no one is faulting Meghan, who was obviously a commoner beforehand, for any struggles that she may have had with adjusting into this new life as a royal. But if you listen to her many endless complaints, starting from the very beginning, as far back as 2016, Meghan's issue was never culture shock. It was the usual unfounded accusations of racism, jealousy, and a complete lack of support from her in-laws. The most that you can describe as some form of culture shock, if you can even call it that, is when she realized that Catherine and William don't wear ripped jeans and walk around barefoot while hugging strangers like she does.
It's like I was a hugger. I've always been a hugger. I didn't realize that that is really jarring for a lot of Brits.
Don't forget, she's a hugger. But from what we've been hearing from the palace staff, it wasn't culture shock that Meghan was suffering from. It was a deep-seated desire to be rejected, as we discussed in previous videos. And whatever it was that motivated that strange, self-sabotaging behavior, whether it was ulterior motives to go back to Hollywood or just jealousy and not being number one, it was Meghan who absolutely refused to learn the ropes and successfully assimilate into royal life. She never even tried to do that, which is a point that I'll be delving much further into in a future video as part of this series. So stick around for that. As with the last video, I've had to do quite a bit of research to find out the closest comparisons. You know, who else was in, if not the same boat as Meghan, then at least a similar boat when it comes to women from a foreign background who were also commoners who happened to marry into royalty. And it turns out it's a big boat. From the pharaohs of old to the 21st century, I looked into a total of 137 foreign commoners who, since the 14th century BCE at the earliest, have married into either royalty or aristocracy. But hold up, before you click out, we're not gonna go through every single one of them. That would be madness, and ain't nobody got time for that. Well, apart from me, because I had to research it, but I digress. You'd be happy to know that I have narrowed down the contenders, the contestants, to a very short list. The criteria I used to make this short list are as follows. Firstly, they must be commoners, which really helped narrow down the list actually, because A, to form or strengthen alliances, most monarchies were somehow related, with royals from this royal family marrying into that royal family, or in the case of the Habsburgs, the same royal family. And B, royals marrying commoners didn't happen anywhere near as frequently in the past. See point A, with some royals getting penalized for marrying a commoner by deeming their union a morganatic marriage, meaning the royals' position, titles, and privileges wouldn't be passed on to their commoner spouse, and whilst any children they may have together were still legitimate, they would also forego all of these perks, thereby automatically precluding them from the line of succession. Now, wouldn't this have been the perfect arrangement for opportunists like Meghan Markle? Granted, morganatic marriages were far more prevalent in the German realms, but given that the Windsors are practically German and only changed their name from Saxe-Coburg-Gotha in 1917, it's a pity that they didn't hang on to that one little German practice to use selectively, because I think Catherine, of course, 100% deserves to have a title and her children are in the line of succession, but to use when things are looking just a little bit iffy. The second criterion was that they must be female, because yes, there are a lot of male commoners who have married royal women. It's not as frequent as the other way around, but it's still more frequent than I imagined. When it comes to Meghan Markle, she does have this annoying habit of pretending that she's the first ever woman to do something or to be in a certain position, and nobody else could ever understand what she's been through or could ever weather the storms that she's pretending to have weathered. And this, of course, extends to her marriage into the royal family as a foreign commoner. We've already discussed in the last video how many titled Americans came before her, and she seems to be oblivious to that fact. Same with the biracial or woman of color aspect, which we'll be discussing in a future video. The reality is, not to be confused with Meghan's orchestrated reality, also known as fiction, there are hundreds of women who have had it so much worse than Meghan could ever possibly conceive. And yet, they've managed to make it work, not just for them, but for their husbands, their in-laws, their subjects, and their new countries. And you know how we left off last video? We closed off with laughing at the fact that Meghan struggled and complained and whined more than once about having to Google and then learn the British national anthem. Yeah, well, Meghan, I know you don't like the name Catherine and it probably triggers you, but meet Catherine the First, Russia's very first empress. And when I say empress, I don't mean the wife of an emperor, because of course there were many before her, but an actual empress who was ruling the realm, at least ostensibly, we'll get to that, instead of her husband, the Emperor Peter the Great, whom she succeeded upon his death. Now, despite being the first empress of Russia, Empress Catherine wasn't even Russian. It's believed she's Lithuanian, no one's 100% sure, but the point is, she was a foreigner who didn't even speak the language. Heck, forget the language, she was a peasant who was illiterate. Full stop. And you know what she did upon meeting her husband, Peter, and becoming first his lover, mistress, consort, and eventually empress, she learned to speak Russian. An illiterate woman who was a peasant, never had any schooling, grew up in very harsh conditions, managed to learn an entirely new language out of respect for her husband and her new country. And then we have Meghan Markle, supposed shining star, highly educated nerd, complaining about having to memorize the British national anthem. And Empress Catherine's efforts didn't even stop there. She was always by her husband's side, supporting him and helping him make Russia prosper, which included building the beautiful St. Petersburg. Even when she succeeded him as empress upon his death, she made sure to complete his projects. And although much of the governing was done by her advisors, making her more of a puppet empress because she was really lacking in that type of ambition. As I already mentioned, she was illiterate and she never really aimed too high. She didn't really have a lust for power, but she still cared for Russia and its people. And the people loved her for that, as well as for her honesty, her patience, her kindness, and her humility. In fact, since we're trying to compare apples with apples here, get this. Upon becoming empress, Catherine looked for her 4 siblings, whom she hadn't seen or even heard from for decades at that point. They were separated very early in life when their parents died of the plague, I believe. She looked for them throughout Europe, found them, plucked them from obscurity and abject poverty before bringing them over to Russia, where she titled them as counts and countesses. I mean, I don't know about you, but that tells me everything I need to know about that woman. Much like how Meghan's treatment of her own family and her in-laws tells us everything we need to know about her. Fast forwarding a few centuries to the very well-loved Queen Maxima of the Netherlands, who is Argentinian by birth and grew up in Buenos Aires, meaning she didn't know a word of Dutch before meeting her husband. Apart from learning this entirely foreign language, she too has thrown herself headfirst into her new role as a royal. And by all accounts, she makes the Netherlands incredibly proud. Ironically, considering the topic we're discussing today, Queen Maxima focuses a considerable amount of her efforts into integrating immigrants into Dutch culture. And she's also an ardent advocate of immigrants learning the Dutch language because she believes that that is crucial for integration or assimilation to truly be successful. So again, you've got one woman, a foreigner, a commoner, working really hard to encourage learning the language, adopting the ways of your new country. And then we have Meghan, who basically rejected that notion entirely and then proceeded to lie and pretend that nothing was ever done to help her assimilate. More on that in a future video. Of course, we cannot discuss successful, well-loved foreign royals without talking about Queen Mary of Denmark, except I already talked about her in a video I made earlier this year in honor of her and her husband's ascension to the throne. So if you haven't seen that one already, I will link it in the cards above. And I really do urge you to see it or just look into Queen Mary because she is just another one of those incredibly hardworking, humble, and just excellent examples of how being a foreigner or being a commoner should never be an obstacle to excelling as a royal. I mean, Meghan couldn't handle being a duchess. Queen Maxima and Queen Mary, although for Queen Mary it's very recent, of course, but they're both queens. You know, there's a lot more responsibility, a lot more of the limelight, a lot more pressure from society for them to succeed, and they still manage to do it relatively seamlessly. That, to me, speaks volumes about their dedication, their humility, their work ethic, and their desire to make their new country and monarchy proud. Speaking of foreign Danish royals, we also have Chinese-born Alexandra Christina, Countess of Frederiksborg, the former Princess Alexandra of Denmark, before her divorce, who also had to learn Danish upon marrying into the family in 1995. Although she did already speak German fluently, which she said made it easier to pick up Danish in a relatively short time, but she still learned an entirely new language and did it so well that she didn't even have an accent eventually, which in addition to her dedication to her role as the women before her, really endeared her to the public. And that concludes my short list. Told you I cut it down quite a bit from 137. Although, to be fair, the royals that we discussed who were titled Americans were also part of that list. So we're sharing, we're spreading them out throughout this series. But once again, we have this scenario where on the one end, you've got Meghan, who's trying to convince us all, or perhaps herself, that all of her failures were extraneous. You know, they had nothing to do with her, and that she was in such an impossible position that she was set up to fail. When the reality is, if you just look a little bit further, just look at other examples, living examples. We don't even have to go all the way back in history. I just do that because I love history. But just looking at the Queen Marys and the Queen Maximas of the world, you can clearly see how preposterous Meghan's narrative is. And you could argue that they went to different families and different cultures, and perhaps these families and cultures were more accepting of them. Except we've discussed at length, and will continue to do so, how willingly not only the monarchy, but the people of Britain embraced Meghan, how much they loved her. And she could do no wrong in their eyes until she showed us who she really is. The crazy thing is, Meghan tries to convince us how singular her situation was when she didn't even have to do 5% of the effort that these other women had to do to successfully integrate into their new roles and their new lives. So, much in the same manner that we ended part 1, I would pose this question. Why is it that Meghan feels that she is exempt from all these efforts? How entitled must one be to expect an entire nation and a monarchy to mold itself around you and bow to your every whim, when every other woman in her position understood the gravity, the role, this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity that presented itself to them, and that they very cleverly didn't want to squander. In the words of Coldplay, nobody said it was easy. Harry himself said in their engagement interview that he had warned her and tried to prepare her for what was to come, and she insisted that she was ready to hit the ground running. But as with everything Meghan Markle, it soon became clear that while she's always willing to talk the talk, there is absolutely no, zero, nil, nada, zilch intention of ever walking the walk. It's such a pity seeing what Meghan could have been. You know, what she could have done with her role as being a biracial woman, as being an American, as being a commoner. She could have used these facets that she believes are weaknesses as the ultimate strength to really make a mark on the world, and she squandered it. And to me, as a young woman who once not necessarily looked up to her but admired her, I find it endlessly disappointing, and I always see other women express the same sentiments. But c'est la vie, as the wonderful French say, and more importantly, it's Meghan's vie, you know, it's her life. And she decided to mess it up. Imagine being in that head. Yikes.